Welcome to the Gamers Tavern, episode 15. Regardless of what Ross is going to say in a moment. You see, there was a slight problem with the audio on this episode. This episode was supposed to feature guests Daryl Hardy and Colin McComb. But there was an issue with Daryl's audio, and I wanted to get the fresh copy before I released it to you because I want to always give you guys the highest quality audio that we can. And congratulations, Daryl, on the birth of your child today. And I could not be the asshole who said, hey, I know you're at the hospital and you're waiting to get discharged with your newborn child that was just born a few hours ago, but hey, if you happen to find a Wi-Fi signal, can you send me about a gig's worth of audio from 3 weeks ago? Yeah, I actually did send that email. I was a little bit more polite than that, though. But needless to say, we had to shuffle around some of the episodes we had pre-recorded. So this episode, instead of being the one with Daryl Hardy and Colin McComb, is actually with guest Chris Avellone, who you may know from several video games that are kind of a big deal. Let's see, Knights of the Old Republic 2, Planescape Torment, Fallout New Vegas, the upcoming Tides of Numenera. Those are just a couple of the games he's had a hand in. And, of course, he's also got a start in tabletop gaming. And we, especially Ross, could not think of a better guest for an episode covering our topic today, villains. Because this man has created some of the best in the business. So, even though we spend a lot of time talking about video games and we're kind of a tabletop gaming podcast, there is still a lot to learn for your home role-playing game, or if you're a video game fan, just sit back and take in the anecdotes. Either way, go grab a drink from the bar and take a seat at the table in the corner. I'll be right back after this word from our sponsor.
Have you been looking for a dark fantasy RPG setting? Are you interested in seeing a new take on the action horror genre? Then you should check out Accursed. Accursed is a setting for the Savage Worlds RPG created by me, Ross Watson, and my good friends Jason Marker and John Dunn. It is a world where the heroes are monsters who fight for redemption against the witches who have conquered their land. To find out more about Accursed, search for Accursed on drivethrurpg.com. Accursed is now on sale there and in many other fine retailers for gaming PDFs. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy Accursed. Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Gamers Tavern podcast. I'm your host, Ross Watson.
And I'm Daryl Mott Jr.
And tonight we have with us one of my favorite game designers, Chris Avellone.
Hey guys. Hey Ross. Hey Daryl. Hey everybody.
Welcome to the show, Chris. It's a real pleasure to have you join us on the Gamers Tavern.
Well, hey, I appreciate you guys asking. I'm really flattered to be here.
Well, one thing we ask all of our guests is to kind of tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, where they may know you from. And we like to phrase this as, what is your gaming character sheet?
My gaming character sheet as well. Wow, that's a tall order. Okay, so I spent the last 19 years doing computer role-playing games, and then before that I was doing pen and paper role-playing games. The most recent big title that I worked on that people may have heard about is Fallout New Vegas, and I did a lot of role-playing games for Interplay Entertainment, their Black Isle division, and then I went on to be one of the co-founders of Obsidian Entertainment, and they did, again, like Fallout New Vegas, Star Wars Knights of the Republic 2, Alpha Protocol, and Neverwinter Nights 2, just a whole bunch of titles for them as well. And we have South Park: The Stick of Truth coming out, and we're also doing the Kickstarter project Pillars of Eternity. And if anyone out in the audience has backed that, we are very, very grateful for your support. Thank you very much. And my gaming character sheet. So it depends on the GM, I've discovered. But if I actually had an ideal GM, I would have a very, this is going to sound kind of odd, a very role-playing based character sheet. Like I would have a lot of speech skills, a number of extraneous skills that don't really add anything to combat. Things like, my character might have a point or two in being able to speak Pig Latin, or they might have certain quirks that don't necessarily mesh with the world. And I've been told by GMs before that when they've received my character sheet, that my character just simply will not survive in their campaign. Like literally, I got that. Like I made one character called Sid the Id, and all he did was he was this very mild-mannered accountant who whenever he heard someone say a particular profession, like, "Hey Sid, you could probably be the world's greatest detective," and then suddenly telepathically he could start amassing information that would make him like that. But basically, like, his core character was actually very, very weak in terms of physical abilities. And then the GM was just like, "Look, Chris, it's an interesting concept. I like where you're trying to go with this, but the first guy with a laser rifle who shows up is going to murder your character." So I'm like, all right, well, that's kind of disappointing. So in the D&D campaign I'm in right now, I'm playing a pretty basic fighter, and then for the Numenera campaign, I almost got killed. Oh, so you were following that? Okay, so yes, I got attacked by that stupid Beheer creature, which does the grapple attack and then can swallow you whole. Both of which happened to me. So I got grappled, and my character's in a strong man for a fighter. Ironically enough, because I had to role play. And then so I'm sitting there trying to get out of its grasp because it's got so many fucking claws, and I can't. Like, it's impossible. So then it swallows me to add insult to injury. So I'm going down its gullet trying to stab my way out with my stupid dagger. And then all my pals finally come to rescue me, and they actually saved the day. I think they saved it by putting the damn thing to sleep and then hauling me out of its gizzard. And it's embarrassing. Like,
did it smell better on the inside?
Actually it probably did. And it's one of those stories where you almost wish there weren't any witnesses, because then you could rewrite it. But no, everyone was there, and they watched me, and many jokes were had. But yeah, it was it was a lot of fun. It was not my finest hour.
Chris, that's one of the best answers we've ever gotten to that question.
I am proud. I am both proud and ashamed to give it to you.
Now,
and number two, actually go ahead, Daryl.
I was gonna say, I got to ask a question because I just got done editing our episode 14, which is an Edition Wars episode. What edition were you playing of D&D?
Oh, we were playing 3.5.
Okay.
And oddly enough, we're also playing in Greyhawk.
Ooh.
Which was kind of a shocker to me, because I didn't realize that I didn't realize a lot of people still gamed in Greyhawk, and that's kind of what I grew up with like Temple of Elemental Evil and Cult of the Reptile God. So when I heard that, I was kind of excited about it too, because usually I'm used to Forgotten Realms campaigns or basically just Numenera.
Yeah, Greyhawk has its own particular feel, which is really cool. And
yeah, I agree.
I think it's exciting you're playing in Greyhawk. But actually, number two, I was going to say, you kind of actually skipped ahead to the next part, which is our what have you been playing lately section. So maybe we can. Have you been playing anything else lately, Chris? Since we're on the subject,
I have been playing the hell out of the Wasteland 2 beta.
Oh yeah.
So bad now. I think they just released a new update yesterday, I believe. So I was actually going to go through the opening of the game and then make all the exact opposite choices, because a lot of the locations change depending on which one you go to help first. And also there was a lot of things that I did both purposely cruelly and inadvertently cruelly that now, armed with that knowledge, I want to go back and do things a little nicer, a little differently. So I'm going to do a run of that. But yeah, I was playing that. I also have been checking out Gone Home. And then I actually started playing Spec Ops The Line, because I heard the storyline they'd done that was pretty solid and kind of interesting, and I want to make sure I experience it.
I've heard some really interesting things about that game as well. But one last question about what you've been playing. Just because as I've said, I've been following you on Facebook. I'm a little bit like a Chris Avellone stalker, I guess you could say.
Oh, that's so comforting and reassuring to hear.
I know.
As I go to lock the doors.
But I had a question about. I know you did a playthrough of Arcanum not so long ago.
I have been playing Arcanum. I am not done with it yet.
Oh, interesting.
I have mixed feelings about it. I will freely admit that I feel that the interface is both beautiful and also equally terrifying to match its beauty. I don't think it's a very well laid out interface, nor is it very intuitive, but it is very pretty to look at. And I'm going to get burned at the stake for this, but just like the Fallout interface, I also thought that the interface for the first Fallouts were not very good interfaces for a game, even though they looked really cool. But on the plus side, I think the Arcanum world is pretty fucking cool. I really enjoy the characters. The ambience is really cool. I like the reactivity, even if the reactivity sometimes makes me scratch my head, because sometimes there's no conceivable way an NPC could know something that they do, unless I'm completely missing something. So sometimes
Toronto. I thought Toronto was very well designed.
I'm looking forward to reaching there. And
you haven't been to Toronto yet? Oh, okay.
I haven't.
All right.
I haven't gone past that first town yet because
it's
horribly scarred by the experience. I'm just kidding. I actually first met up with that drunken ogre who's really making my life a lot better. The companion. I'm sorry, actually the half ogre. He is great. Thank God he showed up. He packs a wall up, and he's not nearly as snide and jerky as Virgil tends to be sometimes.
Yeah, Virgil, well, just like all characters, they go through an evolution. But so I have one last question about Arcanum.
Dun dun dun.
Magic or tech?
Oh, magic.
Sweet.
And unfortunately, the reason for that is, that's not the reason, but I normally gravitate towards magic because I just find it, it's more fantastical. Blah, it's a terrible answer, but I almost hesitated in Arcanum before doing that because I heard that magic, especially the harm spell, is pretty unbalanced, and you could actually go through the game a lot easier if you choose magic. So that kind of made me go, but at the same time, like tech seemed to have so much junk associated with it that it seemed like kind of a management frustration.
Yeah, well,
I'll just go towards magic anyway, and just try not to rely on the harm spell if I don't have to.
Well, we could probably spend a whole episode on Arcanum. I'm a huge fan of it. I've played it numerous times. So,
I tell you what, actually, if you guys are up for it, after I finish my playthrough, I would love to talk to you guys for a session about it, and then we could just kick around Arcanum thoughts, and that would be a fun thing if you guys would be up for it.
I can't see how we could possibly turn that down, Daryl.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Done.
Well, let's get to the meat of the episodes. We need to move ahead, so we're going to talk about what we've been playing with Daryl and then myself. So, Daryl, what have you been playing lately?
We're recording this January 9th, so I just got back from Space CityCon this past weekend. I got to play a lot of games. I actually got to play Cards Against Humanity with Miltos, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, but he is the guy who played Syrio Forel on Game of Thrones.
What do we say to the God of Death?
I actually have that as a black card in my game, autographed by him now.
Not today.
I don't have that one.
Okay, but that's cool that you got to play a game with him.
Yep, I also got to play Zombicide, which is what originally was a Kickstarter game by Cool Mini or Not, which I think still holds the record for the most amount of money for any tabletop game on Kickstarter. It got like 2.4 million, I think.
Holy wow.
Yeah. It's huge. And it's actually a really, really cool game. It's the closest I have seen to something, because a lot of them are trying to be more like B movies. This is really trying to be more like that Romero survival thing along the lines of like Zombies was. But this one does it with that sort of visual style that Last Night on Earth does. So it's a lot of fun.
Is Zombies the one game where you lay down the tiles, you have a little plastic zombie? Okay, I love that game.
Yeah, this is basically plays a little bit like that. There's different scenarios, and some of them actually have like a game master, because there's secrets. Like you have to unlock this door to get to this key, and then you have to take that key to unlock the door to the shelter, so you can get to the shelter to escape the zombies.
Oh, very cool.
That's the scenario I saw. And there's a lot of tactics involved, but it's also really easy to pick up on. And it feels a lot more like, seriously, if they could have got the license, this could have been the Left 4 Dead board game. That's how cool this thing is.
Freaking cool.
Yeah.
My friend Michael Serbrook has actually done up like a whole hero system version of Left 4 Dead that he runs at conventions. So, quick shout out to Mike on that one. But yeah, that's really cool, Daryl.
I actually had a question for you guys. If you guys are big Cards of Humanity fans, which I assume you are, do any of you know a way to actually professionally get cards made for that game? Because I there are so many perfect ways those would make like great Christmas gifts and birthday gifts
They
to
are
actually
for
give.
sale officially only on one place, and that's Amazon.com. The core set's $25, and each of the 4 expansions is $10 each.
I think Chris wants to get some custom ones
If
made.
you're wanting to get custom ones printed, I would actually suggest emailing the guys behind Cards Against Humanity. They're all really, really cool guys, and they actually just finished wrapping up their...
I would be so afraid to. They seem like they might mock me or be like super sarcastic.
No, they are the nicest, coolest people on the planet.
Okay.
I've dealt with them before. I randomly tweeted to them, "Hey guys, since I'm going to a lot of cons, I could really use more blank cards. Guys should like sell a pack of them." Got a direct message from them saying, "Hey, do you want some? We got a bunch laying around the place. Mailed them to me, no charge."
That is
like
cool.
A stack of about 2-3 dozen of them. So yeah, these guys are really cool. I would suggest talking to them, or if you know anyone who's working in tabletop that just may have gotten a deck of cards printed as an accessory for their game, possibly. Anyone? Bueller?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, the Accursed play card deck.
Oh, well, those are poker cards, though. It's not the same thing.
But it's similar printing. It's print on demand, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's print on demand through Drive-Thru RPG, so... Okay, well, speaking of Accursed, this is probably a great chance for me to mention that Chris Avellone has agreed to write a source book for Accursed, as he's one of our stretch goals on the Kickstarter, and since we reached our goal for that, he's actually going to be writing a really impressive source book on Hebron, if that's correct, right? Is that the one you picked?
That is absolutely correct, and yeah. I'm doing the source book with my partner in crime, George Zeitz, who I've worked with on many projects in the past, and we both went through the Accursed source book, broke it down, and I think we both agreed on the Great Nation combination of just doing Hebron and Euphrates and
mummies and golems.
Yep, that sounds like it's going to be fun. It's actually kind of interesting because usually George prefers to do, for some reason, like he does a lot of design work and like enjoys doing golems. So I feel a little bit weird this time actually tackling like the more golem-y nation. So we'll see how that all turns out.
Well, it's going to be cool because the best way I could describe Hebron is Judea plus Hollywood Sparta.
Yeah.
So it's going to be awesome. I can't wait to do it. So anyway, so you heard it here first. This is what's happening with Chris Avellone for writing for Accursed. And what I've been playing lately, I've also, of course, been running Accursed on a weekly basis. And my friends have still continuing to run Marvel Superheroes for us as a side game, which is really fun.
Oh, my God.
And I got to do a quick shout out to my friends Matt Steen and Nate Barlow, because they gave me this great idea that I stole from them completely, even stole the name. But they said, what's really fun is if you're playing one of those side games and you just kind of want to have a good time with, shall we say, a more action-oriented style. They said, name your character like he's in one of the Expendables movies. So my character, and again, this is stolen from my friends, but my character for the Marvel Superheroes game is Marriott Sweets. And he speaks in the third person, so he says, Marriott Sweets thinks this is a good idea. And
I can't wait till he meets Hilton Honors.
Oh, yeah.
Or Starwood Preferred.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun with that. And my good friend Mark Carroll is actually gearing up to run Torg, possibly. We are discussing it. And I'm hoping we can get...
about that.
I hope we can get a Torg game off the ground, because I would love to play my Rocket Ranger again. So that's what I've been playing. And so we should probably tell the listeners what this episode is actually all about. And this episode is all about villains. See, as I said, I'm kind of a Chris Avellone stalker, and one of the things I think Chris does better than almost anyone else is he comes up with some really interesting and unique villains for his games. And I thought that would be something our listeners want to know about, is what makes a villain, and how you create those real memorable antagonists for your game. And, Daryl, of course, he threw in some of his 2 cents, which is, like what makes a villain more than an antagonist, right? I mean, how do you separate those two things? So maybe that's the first thing we should dive into on villains. Chris, what do you think about that term villain as opposed to antagonist?
That's a really good question. I'm a little bit stumped because a lot of the more recent work has been just designing people that are more friendly towards the player. However, I guess that does transition into answering your question, because when we were doing the first iteration of Fallout 3 back at Interplay,
Van Buren,
right, we actually had that as the sort of one of the questions about the title, because the quote-unquote villains weren't really villains. They were just simply another group of people that had been thrust in the same circumstances you were, and they weren't out to necessarily hurt. They were more like rivals to what was going on in the situation. And so when they were going through the environment, they were acting as antagonists because they would do things in other areas that would cause ripple effects for you that could be dangerous, or alternately positive. But ultimately they were working at cross purposes with you, even if they didn't necessarily mean you specifically any harm. So for a villain, I'd assume that one way you want to break it down is they would embody some sort of sin or vice or flaw, and use that in a hateful manner. Or I guess that's probably what jumps to mind. When I was actually doing enemy source books way back when for the hero system.
Oh yeah.
There was actually a difference in some of the classifications of villain versus antagonist, because usually some of the antagonists we'd design were ones that would create a situation that would be dangerous, but they didn't necessarily care about hurting someone. It was just a side effect of what they were doing. Like we had a antagonist called Ashtray Art.
Oh yes, this is the guy who was in love with fire.
Yeah, he literally
kind of like a proto
that,
Ignis.
Right. He just thought that fire was a living, breathing creature that was deserving of romance and to be given her tributes and gifts, and
which is really kind of a heroic. I mean, that's a thing we can all get behind. Sympathetic idea that love. He's really just a champion of love.
Yeah, and I had been surrounded by so many art students in college that were so embracing this high ideal that I thought if you combine that with pyromania, you could have a pretty interesting character. So he was one that was a lot of fun to design. And then we had another antagonist who literally she was just so boring that people people absolutely would not register her. Like telepathically, she had the ability to shut them out, and they would just forget that she was there. So everything she did was just try to attract attention so people would notice her, and of course that created all sorts of unpleasant repercussions.
Oh, her desperate attempts to get noticed, I think, is one of my. I mean, if we could talk about Underworld Enemies, for anybody out there who's looking for a book full of amazingly cool bad guys for a street-level superhero game, you should look for this book from 1993. It's 20 years old, called Underworld Enemies by Chris Avellone. And yeah, we were just talking about Plain Jane, who's definitely one of my favorite entries in there.
Yeah, it was the first big source book I ever got a chance to write, and I think eventually the editors were so desperate to publish something. And
I should mention this is for the 4th edition Hero System RPG.
And I'd sent them so much stuff before, and then Monty Cook was my first editor, and he'd given me a lot of rejections, which is kind of ironic because then I ended up going on to work on Planescape, which he was a big part of, and now I'm working on a Numenera game, so it's kind of interesting how the cycle goes around. And then a new line opened up with the hero system. Like, hey, we're going to do Dark Champions. It's going to be a lot like if we're doing like a Batman focused street level campaign. And they're like, hey, well, we need products for this line. Do you want to do one? I'm like, yep. And then I just started writing the character book, and so there were some days where it was really hard to get something out, and then other days it was just a lot of fun. But yeah, I was really happy with how it turned out.
Forgive me for a second, but I just love Underworld Enemies. It's one of my, I go and point to it and say, this is a great book full of bad guys and villains. And I would like to talk about at least a couple more of the really memorable ones from this book. I want to ask you about the Hanged Man. For me, the Hanged Man is just one of the best, most interesting villains I've seen for that street level superhero idea. And you could take him to, you know, almost any genre, but tell us about the Hanged Man.
His character concept was actually birthed by a line that Harlan Ellison used in one of his stories. Ooh. And I believe, if I recall correctly, the line was, any social change that doesn't harm, I think, over 49 or 50% of the population is worth exploring. And with the Hanged Man, his concept was he was raised in a neighborhood and a high school where violence just thrived. And his opinion was, the more guns that I give people and the more weapons and ways to kill themselves, they will eventually wipe each other out. And of course, there'll be casualties along the way, but as long as that 50% mark isn't broken, the overall net gain to society will be more. And he had a way of escalating conflicts and giving discount rates. And if, someone held onto a gun too long, he could, detonate it there was all sorts of different ways that he was monitoring the criminal activity in the city. And, he was basically just a big weapons supplier in the hopes that all these,
That's what I loved about him, is on the surface, he actually looks like your typical bad guy that Batman would bust, because he's an arms dealer and he's selling to criminals. So on the very surface, you're like, okay, yeah, he's just another bad guy for Batman to beat up. But then you read about him and you're like, no, he wants crime off the street. I mean, in fact, I almost think of the Hanged Man as this is another direction Batman could have gone, because he's a brilliant man with a lot of money, and he just chose to use his skills for the same goal as Batman, but in a different, completely different, ends justify the means type of approach.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about him. He's just fantastic. So another, I guess, again, forgive me, but I studied up on this book before I talked to you, because
I'm more than happy to answer. This is the first time I ever got a chance to talk about it, so I'm it's like a trip down memory lane for me.
One of the coolest bad guys in the book, and he's cool because of his concept. I mean, I struggled to find a way to actually use him in a game, but his concept is brilliant. The guy's name is the Fool, and the concept behind the Fool is that he sees the world as character sheets. He can actually see everyone's character sheet in the game, in the world, and he understands that heroes and villains, people that are more significant in that world, have bigger and more expansive character sheets. And he was driven mad because his whole family, aside from himself, were, their character sheets were pretty blank. And that's the thing that I was like, oh my God, that's so kind of awesome. Is because he's scrawling. Yeah, it's meta, but he's scrawling STR, DEX, and CON on the wall of his cell, where he's gone completely nuts. And all the psychiatrists are like, I'm not sure what these mean.
Yeah.
But I thought that was just I was like, man, that is a really cool way to drive someone nuts.
Yeah, I figured that he could see the basic uselessness in everyone's lives, and how everyone was basically reduced to numbers, and exactly how much agency they really had, if they had any agency at all. So yeah, I thought that would be a interesting take. I was kind of worried it was a little bit too meta, but I still wanted to explore the concept and said, what the hell?
Oh God, he's by far one of the neatest bad guys I've ever seen as far as concept. I struggle to use him because he's kind of a freak. He has no hands. So he's no hands, let's put it that way, just right away. And that kind of makes him a little tough to sometimes bring out, unless he's just a henchman, which he technically is. He's a henchman of the Idiot King. But suffice to say, again, I think anybody who's interested in looking at some really interesting bad guys for superheroes in street level games should check this book out, because we've just really scratched the surface of some of the great characters that are in here. There's another one that has just a great name, Gunmetal Silk, Cyborg.
Yes.
She was cool as a name. I loved her name.
And I have to give a nod to William Gibson, because I believe that's the opening description of the city in Neuromancer. And I was like, man, that's a beautiful combination of an adjective.
It is.
And then I'm like, hey, it would be really
it.
cool to have a character named Gunmetal Silk. So ding.
I'm totally going to steal that for my next Shadowrun character. It's awesome. So yeah, again, and I think it's fair to say we can. I don't want to leave Daryl out of this conversation too much longer, so I want to. Probably ought to move on, but
Daryl,
thank
come
you
back
so much.
to us, Daryl.
Thank you so much for sharing some thoughts with us about that book. Because
sure, absolutely, my pleasure.
Yeah, it is. Again, it's very, very cool. So, Daryl, what about you? What do you have to say about villains and antagonists?
To me, it always seems to be a question of larger than life. Villains, to me, even low-level basic villains, just have this sort of quality that it takes them beyond just the normal run-of-the-mill guy. Sure, there's the underbosses and everything else. They're nothing. The villain is always the target, because the villain has as much depth of character as the main characters do.
Okay, so you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the difference between a villain and an antagonist is antagonists can be minor, can basically be minor, insignificant problems for the protagonist to overcome, but a villain should not be minor or insignificant.
At least not to me.
Okay, no, I think that's a reasonable point.
I think that's a pretty good way of classifying him. It's like Doctor Doom versus a gun-wielding thug.
Yeah, they're both antagonists, but only one of them is a villain.
For example, in Dresden Files, I don't really see Nicodemus as a villain, because even though he is larger than life and everything else, he's an antagonist because you kind of like him at the same time. That's another thing. A villain is there to be kind of hated, but you like him at the same time.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that. I think there's actually two types of villains, in my opinion. There's the faceless, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be faceless, but let's call them the implacable force of nature. Okay? Good example is the Tyranids in Warhammer 40k, the Zerg. You can have an implacable force of nature as a villain, and that can be a thing that you and your group, especially since we're putting this in RPG context, you and your group are struggling to overcome. But there can also be, and I think this is where you were coming from, the sympathetic or relatable villain, where you may not, he may be thoroughly and irredeemably evil, or he may be just slightly misguided, but either way, we can at least understand what his motive is.
Yeah, and that's my thing, is a villain doesn't necessarily have to be sympathetic, and sometimes you have to work really hard to make a true villain sympathetic, in my opinion.
Well, and like I said, I don't think all villains have to be. I think if you really want, you can have the implacable force of nature. And
oh yes,
I'm gonna go ahead and use another Chris Avellone example.
Okay.
So Chris, one of my favorite examples of bad guys that I go to and look at and say, wow, these are some really cool bad guys. Come from Knights of the Old Republic 2, where we have the tripod. What's the word I'm looking for here? The triad, the trifecta, the triad of Sith lords. Okay, and one of these Sith lords, Darth Nihilus, is basically an implacable force of nature.
Correct.
He doesn't really have a personality to interact with. He doesn't really have a goal beyond consuming.
Correct.
Everything.
And yes, you're absolutely correct.
Now, his relationship with Visas Mar is actually like the one part that you kind of get the impression he still has some human left in him. But and I like that there's hints that he definitely used to be more human. But in terms of the game and in terms of the story that you as the protagonist play through KOTOR 2 is, he's really that implacable force of nature you must somehow find a way to defeat. There's no reasoning with him.
That is correct. He is designed to embody the absolutely worst qualities of the dark side of the Force. Like the way the Sith teachings would see Darth Nihilus is a very, very empty path and a dead end, because all he becomes is he loses any shred of desire to aspire to some higher teaching. He just becomes hunger, and that in itself is a very empty path for any sort of Sith teaching to follow. And the implication we tried to give was, even though the Force technique that Nihilus uses is extremely powerful and extremely effective, it's ultimately something that no Sith wants to use
The
because
cost is too high.
The cost is just too high. You lose all your individuality, and to an extent, Nihilus was also supposed to represent like all that I hated about the nature of the Force and the all-encompassing nature of it. And then if you apply that to the dark side, the whole overall just grasping for power, the gluttony, the hunger, like that's just a dead end all in itself. So that he was intended as yes, more of a force of nature as opposed to something more relatable, like either like Sion or Kreia or even Treya to an extent.
Spoilers.
So it's all
So actually, if you don't mind, and again, forgive me, Daryl, but I'm jumping in I want to talk about Darth Sion a little bit. Now, I think Darth Sion is a really, really cool character. I stole him lock, stock, and barrel for my Shadows Angelus 2 campaign. I created a Yakuza guy who was put back together from little pieces. They called him the Broken One. And I was like, yeah, I love the concept behind Darth Sion. But can you tell us, since we're talking about the differences, Darth Sion is relatable. He is not a force of nature. You can reason with him. Maybe you could tell us what his deal was and how that worked out in the game to where you could kind of still reach him as a person.
I figured that because Nihilus was sort of like the technically the main adversary in the game, and he was such a force of nature, making him a force of nature is actually a problem because there's nothing to really socialize against or nothing to really affect in your immediate presence. So Darth Sion kind of served that role. Well, he had a few purposes, but ultimately, Sion was a lot like Darth Maul in the sense that he's a very physical Sith. Like he's there in the moment. He's physically trying to hold himself together through force of will, and he's a direct antagonist that you can have various battles with, as opposed to Nihilus, where once you go in, like it's basically all or nothing.
How do you fight a hurricane?
yeah, exactly.
But you can fight Darth Sion. Yeah.
Correct. Yes, and I think ultimately, however, there was some intentions with the arc with Sion, which didn't really, in my opinion, work out quite so well. But we thought it would be interesting that there was the chance for him to actually have romance feelings for the player character depending on choices of the game and what you discovered about him, but we weren't able to fully achieve that to the way that I think it was effective. And also there was one other aspect which I think is worth mentioning. The voice casting for it surprised me, because the voice director at LucasArts decided to do a take on him that I thought was kind of interesting, and I thought, kudos to them. They did that for a few characters that worked out really well, and so I think that also kind of gave him an extra shade of personality that I wasn't expecting. So that definitely helped as well.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to look him up on Wikipedia again, because I think his story and his concept is really cool.
Yeah, and also, to be honest, one of the things we needed to provide a hint that Sion had served another Sith Lord, and so he was there to also remind the player during the game that, hey, guess what, here was the person that I used to serve, and I'm a reminder of that. I'm her, disciple, pupil. I'm here to, as a story element in that respect as well.
Kind of to show, and I think this is also going to, we've been talking about, this as a video game, but it applies to tabletop as well, because what you're doing is you're showing the players. You're not telling them, but you're showing them what their possible future is.
Exactly.
This is one way you could go. This is one of your possible endings, if you follow what Darth Treya has to say. So yeah, I think, again, it's really interesting stuff there, but we have been talking about, well, in my opinion, these are all very iconic villains, but Daryl wanted to touch on that specifically. Daryl, can you tell us more about what you were looking to discuss with regards to iconic villainy?
Well, there are just some villains that almost become an archetype of their own. Well, for example, the Joker.
Oh, yeah.
The Joker is, honestly, he's a base off of pretty much mythology. That's Loki running around. That's Eris. That's Coyote.
Yeah, he is a trickster archetype. There's no doubt about it. But he's got his own sinister take on that too.
Exactly.
Just like Loki from the Thor films is not the Joker, but they're both the same type of character.
And they're just some of those characters that get so big that in a modern sense, they can actually redefine that archetype. Like if I mention Loki to people, first thing that's going to pop into their head is the Avengers, for the most part. But if I say the Joker, that archetype is going to pop into their head far better. From the mythological Loki, it's going to pop into their head perfectly.
Can I mention one I think that actually applies almost directly to gaming, though?
Sure.
If I had to pick one that was iconic from a gaming source, and I'm reaching a little bit here, I'm actually going to say Wasteland.
Yes.
Okay.
I think Wasteland's pretty iconic. I mean, there are a few, Dark Wizard archetypes out there, Saruman, for one. But if there's a particular, I think, trope and style to Wasteland that I don't think has really been quite equaled in a lot of other media. Our understanding of that particular trope or archetype of villain.
Yeah, I thought he was a pretty well-crafted character, and he went in directions that I wasn't expecting, and I thought they were pretty brave directions.
And, I mean, to a lesser extent, maybe Lord Soth would be another good example. But it's hard for me to think of any other from gaming, though, that hasn't, that doesn't have its roots that lie in maybe more deeper.
Strahd? Count Strahd?
Strahd has his roots, I think, very solidly in Dracula. I don't think he's iconic like Graceland was iconic or like Lord Soth was iconic, because he is basically a reflection or a shadow of Dracula. I mean, agreed. He's cool and iconic. It was, if we lift everything out, we just talked about role playing games in a vacuum of anything else. Yes, he's pretty iconic. I guess I go for that.
Would you consider Vecna iconic?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean,
he's still that same kind of Wasteland archetype. Only he went.
Well, it's basically evil wizard plus undead. I mean, it's hard. Could you describe Vecna without use that test where you describe a character without saying what they do or what they look like? With Vecna, I don't think that's something you could do. With Wasteland, I think it is. Do you know the test I'm talking about, Daryl?
I've heard it before, but
yeah.
I've never actually tried to put it in practice.
It's famously the test which the Star Wars prequels fail at miserably. Name a character from Star Wars, without their job or what they look like. You could say, okay, let's talk about Han Solo. Well, he's a scoundrel. It's not technically his job. He's a smuggler. He's cocky. He's brash. He's heart of gold, right? You can describe Han Solo in a ton of different ways without ever referring to his name or his job, right? But anyway, we can get off topic by going too far down that rabbit hole. But
we're still talking about characters. We're just happen to be talking about the good guys right now.
Well, yeah, okay, but applying it to villains is saying, I think one good way to give someone iconic status as a villain is to see if they if you can do that test. Like Dr. Doom. We can describe Dr. Doom without saying dictator and without saying Dr. Doom. We can say ultimate pride, because dude is, I am Doom, right? You can say brilliant. You can say twisted. You can say noble.
Deep. He has obviously a very strong love for his mother, which is actually a very redeemable quality. I mean, he's willing to win.
Susan Storm.
Yes. And then he obviously has a great deal of protective feelings towards the nation he founded, which is also a very redeeming quality.
Noblesse oblige.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think Dr. Doom, would pass that test, and I would then say to you, Daryl, I think that might be one way to define an iconic villain would be to say, can you describe him without using his raw physical characteristics or his job?
Fair enough.
So anyway, that's just a thought.
We should start a game show where we start doing that.
The password is Yoda. Okay, no, I think that's all very good stuff. Again, I think one of the reasons why I asked Chris to come on for this particular episode is you have some really recognizable bad guys throughout your games. I want to go a little bit more recent and talk about New Vegas. And there's, of course, Caesar or Kaisar, as he's mentioned in the game with the original pronunciation, who is a interesting character. I don't think he's quite as complex as some of your other villains, but he's definitely a big part of the game.
That is I should probably clarify the source of Kaisar and House and those two figures in New Vegas. So the lead writer, creative designer for New Vegas was John Gonzalez, and he is the one who fleshed out those characters. I think Kaisar is kind of a difficult challenge because I think one aspect of New Vegas is that the Legion side may not have been presented as strongly as the NCR side, and I think part of that might just be due to the actual physical geography of the Mojave. But Kaisar, I think, had a little bit of difficulty in terms of how quickly and how easily potentially you could relate to him. I'm mostly just comparing him to Mr. House, because Mr. House, I think.
Oh yeah, that's a much better example, I think, of a memorable.
Mr. House was pretty much John. If I recall correctly, John is the one who birthed that character, and I think House is a prime example of what a Fallout antagonist should be. He's a larger than life figure. He, and this is not a minor point, but he has a catchy name. It's very, very archetypal name, and that I think that falls back to the early roots of Fallout, where a lot of the major NPCs you found in the Fallout games before that point did have larger than life names like that, like Set, the Master, like all of those things were very much larger than any sort of human designation. So I think he did a good job there, and House had very complex motives that. When Tim Kaine, who was part of the trifecta that helped do guide Fallout 1's vision, when he was playing through for New Vegas, he chose Mr. House, and his reason was, regardless of whatever issues House has, he actually is the one that's presenting a reasonable, pragmatic plan for where humanity should go. And I thought that was a really interesting answer, because he was like, you know what, I cared enough to analyze what House's motives were versus NCR and versus Kaisar and versus what I could do. And I thought I understood that character enough that I was willing to sympathize and uphold his philosophy, which, from a game designer standpoint, John Gonzalez should be very, very proud of, because that's exactly what you want to do with a major character.
So would you say, like, from a DM's point of view, then, if you're making a villain for your role-playing game, then maybe some things on your checklist ought to be larger than life figure, very thematic name, and complex motives.
Sure, and also it also doesn't hurt if, for that bad guy antagonist, / villain, if at some point when the players figure out what his agenda is and why, at least one of them says, "Oh, I get it," or "I understand why he's doing that. I just don't approve the way he's doing it."
Yeah,
and I think that definitely helps, because
if we could contrast him really quickly with Nihilus, I mean, Nihilus doesn't have complex motives, but he's still a great villain. I think it's fair to say that complex motives can help bring out, I think it's a tool, but I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that you do get a sort of like I guess a drama bonus of +5. If there's ever any point where the players actually sympathize with something a villain is doing, like the example that I always try and use is, some of the best ways to generate sympathy in a movie for a character is to have that character embody what the audience is thinking. Like, I think one of the reasons Aliens is great is because Ripley says everything that you and the audience are thinking. Like, sure, get off the planet and nuke the aliens from orbit. who is not thinking that in the movie theater? Like, that is the smart thing to do.
Well, there is a substantial dollar value attached to this installation.
And that just makes you hate Burke more. You're just like, oh, God, that fucking slimy worm. But ultimately, like with Ripley, though,
they could bill me.
Yeah, exactly. And the audience is thinking that. So immediately they're like, she's my woman. Like, God damn it. Like, I understand where she's coming from.
She was even
She's
doing that in the first
everything I
Alien
want to
movie.
say. Yeah, and if you can make a villain do that too, like, I think you're just on the path to win.
So, well, I guess larger than life. I mean, I want to go back to what you just said as well, because I think that's a very good point. But one last thing on larger than life. If I had to pick a larger than life bad guy from the New Vegas milieu, to use a word, I would have to select Dr. Mobius.
Oh, interesting.
Because he is the epitome of a larger than life. He is all about science with a capital S and an exclamation point.
And he's such a nice guy.
He wants to conquer all of science with his robo-scorpions. And, in the end, and this is, well, again, spoilers, but one of the best things about Dr. Mobius in the end, you find out his motives all along, although he seems like this crazy 1950s, out of his freaking gourd scientist, mad scientist, epitome. At the very end, he's like, no, I'm doing this to help them, to help the people that you've been helping all along. And it's a wonderful experience to find out that the villain I've been fighting is actually has a pretty good his motivation is something I can get behind.
He's intended to sort of brace up that stereotype, and then his actions throughout that DLC are intended to serve as distractions to protect everybody else. And again, in the end, if you decide that it's probably best if you attack him and kill him, he's still okay with that too, because he's just because
he's Dr. Mobius.
He's generally an all right guy. So and this is something I haven't mentioned before, but that opening line where, like, the first thing, like, I wanted players to feel when they actually confront Mobius is like, because he's running around his little chamber and he's singing to himself, and I thought that'd be kind of like, well, that's not what I was expecting. And then, like, past the singing, his first thing is to offer you a mentat. That offering the mentat was intended as a tip of the hat to how Tom Baker.
Yeah, the Jelly Babies.
Yes, exactly.
Totally
Thank you. And because Tom Baker would always try to smooth over any interaction with somebody just by proffering food. And then I'm like, what would Dr. Mobius offer? Then I'm like, oh, he would offer drugs. So he's like, he wants everybody to be smarter because they do such great things for him.
Yeah, to be fair, in the Fallout universe, mentats are pretty much the harmlessest. They're on the low end of bad drugs, just saying. But
yes. And although Radaway might actually be
Radaway's probably the lowest, agreed. It's the most innocuous, but mentats are not that. Anyway, suffice to say, what we've been talking about, just for the listeners who may not know, Chris's game, Fallout New Vegas, has a DLC, absolutely brilliant, just should have won every award in the world DLC, called Old World Blues. And Old World Blues is where Dr. Mobius shows up, and you should totally play it.
And I have to throw out another tip of the hat. I had two other writers on that DLC for which I am incredibly thankful. One was Robert Lee, who did a lot of the emails and the text messages that appeared in the DLC. But in addition to that, I also worked with a fantastic writer named Travis Stout, who I believe is at Ubisoft right now, and it's very difficult to communicate how fantastic a job he did, but I'll try. I was trying to figure out how to do the home base mechanics in Old World Blues, and the only thing I knew for certain was that I wanted a bunch of different functionality, and I wanted talking appliances like we're part of like Spider Jerusalem's like apartment and Transmetropolitan, if anyone's ever read that. I was like, Travis, I this is what I'm looking for. Like, I need like a little Securitron that collects mugs. Like,
Muggy.
I just need exactly. I need a bunch of appliances that have personalities, so when you interact with them, like, they're totally crazy and funny and they fit in with the scientist. And he's like, stand back. and then he went to town, and he made the light switches that fought with each other.
Oh, yeah.
And then he got had Jace Hall doing the crazy power hungry the ruthless toaster, and like he
So
did
the toaster
such a
is just
good
a
job
death
with
ray
those.
with
Like it's
a weaker
fantastic.
power source.
Yes, yes, and Travis is
Insufficient
to be
power
commended. Travis did a fantastic job in that DLC, and I loved working with him. He was great.
Well, yeah. I think it's wonderful, but I don't want to leave. Again, I'm trying not to leave Daryl out because it's a shame.
I'm having fun listening to you guys.
Daryl, come back to us.
So, Daryl, do you have anything else you wanted to cover about iconic villains or what makes a good villain?
You guys actually brought up something I wanted to talk about that's not directly gaming related when you talked about Tom Baker, and that is, of course, the Doctor's iconic enemy, the Daleks.
Well, okay, them and the Master, I think I would say the two biggest, but yeah.
And those seem to be on the two different ends of the spectrum of what we've been kind of talking about.
Yeah, because some of the
Master
Daleks are implacable force, certainly.
The Daleks are implacable force. There are millions of them, but even one of them is enough to inspire fear.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Master is a plotter and a schemer, depending on which version thereof. So, but they're both iconic classic villains, and especially in the new Doctor, though, Daleks show up a lot.
Well, yeah, but I think you got a good point that there's a lot of examples of both those types of villains in culture and in gaming in general. Like even the old D&D cartoon, I think you could argue that Tiamat was the embodiment of the unstoppable force, the implacable force, and Venger being the slightly more relatable villain.
I'd agree with that.
Slightly more relatable. He was. Listen, the man had an awesome voice, but not an especially deep character. So there's that. But anyway, there's a really good thing about villains that Daryl wanted to talk about. There's a guy that we're fans of called the Spoony One, and he does various web shows about gaming. And he did one about villains and player agency and when and how you can sort of keep your villain alive without removing the ability of your characters to feel like they have some kind of choice or some kind of impact on your world. And Daryl, this is where I want you to come in. Can you explain to Chris what that situation is, and then maybe we'll analyze it?
Well, in this specific case, what it was is he was playing in a Star Wars role-playing game. I believe it was the D6 version. And he wanted to give a little treat for us. They were rebel teams doing this raid thing, and they had accomplished their mission. He kind of wanted to give them a little Easter egg treat and bring them into the Star Wars universe. And so we had them run into Darth Vader, kind of like they catch him escaping on his jet after they're blowing up the facility. And so instead of just taking that as the Easter egg it was, the player characters, of course, their first reaction is, we have to kill Darth Vader. Which they can't do. They're in the middle of the Rebel Alliance, so it's the middle of the Rebel era. I think they were playing like around Empire sort of time frame. Can't really kill Darth Vader in that era, or else you're completely breaking from the story, which defeats the purpose. So, my question is, how can you get, especially in gaming, how can you get these iconic villains, these great, beautiful characters that we all love to hate, into a game without getting them killed too early before they see here's my master plan, Bond, before they have that moment, without just completely stonewalling the characters and railroading them and saying, no, you can't kill this guy right now. Or
you don't want to remove their agency.
Exactly, pulling off some weird, elaborate... My players actually browbeat me every time I used contingency for a villain in D&D. Because it was such a cheeseball way. Contingency to a teleport spell whenever he falls below X hit points.
But it's such a smart thing to do.
It is, and every single magic user capable of casting those two spells would do that. Good guy or bad guy.
So Daryl, you've identified a problem that computer games have quite frequently. And when you introduce a villain, how do you protect that villain so he still has the drama and the iconic nature, but yet the players don't feel like they're gypped and not hurting and or killing him. Okay, and that's a really tough thing to deal with. The first unconventional solution in a role-playing game is you do what Quentin Tarantino did in Inglourious Bastards. And I don't want to spoil it, but that is always a very entertaining option and should not be discounted.
And that is just to accept it and let things change, basically.
Let the players have their day.
That villain. I was thinking about the other villain in the movie. Yeah. Oh, okay.
So there's
for
that.
Hitler. You're talking about Hitler.
Well, I was trying to spoil it.
The conceit is that you go into that movie thinking that nothing can change, and Quentin turns it on its head, and that's fine, and I think that's great, and I think that was amazing.
It took me a year and a half after that movie came out to watch it, and I managed to get unspoiled. So I don't know how the hell I did that, but...
The other thing to do is you don't ever actually present the players with a situation where they think that they could hurt or harm that villain, and it makes sense to them. And
Arkham Asylum.
Yes. Like when the Joker speaks through a TV, that's fine. Like when Vader speaks through a holographic projection, he's there, but he's not. The players don't immediately think, "Oh, I could take out a lightsaber and kill this guy." Well, no.
Arkham City did a really good thing where they had you fight the Joker, but it turns out it was Clayface pretending to be Joker. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. You get the players feel like they had a chance to sort of see, test themselves against the villain, yet their victory turns out to be only another step towards that final confrontation.
Well, then you run into the Doombot problem.
Well, is that a problem, really? I mean, I think it's actually in the right genre. It's part of the trope, right? I mean, it's really just part of what you're part and parcel of what you signed on for, I guess. If I was playing a Fantastic Four role playing game, right, I wouldn't feel gypped if I had to fight a Doombot because that's what they do.
And I would probably see things like Doombots as opportunities. And I don't know if any of you guys have been reading the Avengers AI series they just started.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, they recruited a Doombot. And it is fantastic. Like he's reacting all the ways that Doctor Doom would, but he's on the side of the heroes.
See, that's an awesome idea right there. I love it.
Oh my God, there's one great moment where Daredevil has quote unquote the audacity to try and stop a Doombot on its way to help the rest of the team. And Hank Pym's sitting there going, Doombot, you're like, where the hell are you? And Doombot just goes, I will be there momentarily. I have to kill a superhero first. And it's just he's filled with things like this that just make this situation more entertaining. But ultimately, because the player characters in that situation were able to convert one of those drones, that just ended up creating an interesting experience for the players. So if you can look for things like that, that's fantastic. Or if there's some way, if Darth Vader shows up, maybe you can't hurt him, but because of the player's actions, maybe Darth Vader actually wipes out someone that was standing in the player's way because of something the players did, leaving evidence or humiliating the guy or drawing too much attention to him. All of those things are hey, well, I got Vader to do some of my dirty work for me. Now I feel really cool. So there's ways to do it, but just dangling the person's physical presence in front of players can often breed resentment if you have to make them invulnerable. So it's a matter of context.
I think you're right, Chris, but I would go another step further. I'd say I think if that's your goal, if you want to show the villain and let the players sort of encounter him later, I think one of the key things here you need to build with your group, because it is a social group, is trust. I mean, if they trust you that it's going to be awesome when you finally meet the Joker, right? They're going to be more willing to say, okay, yeah, well, maybe we fought a guy who was, pretending to be Joker, and we're not going to be resentful about that because we trust you that it's going to be awesome in the end. Now, of course, it's harder if you got a group that you haven't gamed with very long, or if there's social issues in that group where trust is just not is difficult to come by. But in that case, I think I would encourage a GM, at least my advice would be, and take that with a grain of salt, my advice would be to be a little open with it. It's okay to be open with your group and say, guys, here's the thing. I realize that, this might be frustrating to you, but just, believe me, it's going to be awesome when this pays off.
I think that's a very pragmatic way to go. I also think that's polite to players too. I think once they understand a compact like that, as long as you're explaining yourself, which you can absolutely do, and there's no reason not to. But now I'm obsessed with the Darth Vader example. So this is all you're to blame for this, Daryl. But now I'm thinking
we'll have a link to that video in the show notes.
Yes.
So one of the harshest lessons I've learned was actually in a Fallout pen and paper game back at Interplay, where the developers were squaring off against like the rival party, and like I had one of the antagonists who I designed this whole backstory for him. I had a lot of cool ideas for things he could do. And one of the players just went up and critted him with a shotgun. And at that moment, I had a choice. Like, I could either play the GM card and go, well, something happened. It didn't quite work. He survived, blah, blah, blah. Or I could just roll with it. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm just going to roll with it and see what happens. And like, in your example, Daryl, like, I can't help but think, like, what if your players had killed Darth Vader? Like, and then you're like, okay, the rest of the campaign is now what all the future movies would have been like without Vader. Like, who would the Emperor have gotten as the new disciple? And like, how hard would he have found Luke Skywalker?
Mara
earlier?
Jade.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and there's like a whole bunch of possibilities. And like, what player would not want to go into the movies knowing they'd start the whole thing off by killing Vader, and then they would want to see what happened after. It's like a huge what if scenario. I think that would be like fantastic. I would want to play in a game that had the plot lines of the movies, but like if I'd killed Vader from the outset, like I would want to know what happened from that point, like all the repercussions and like the domino effect. Like, I don't know. I think that could be really, really cool.
I'm going to tell a quick story too. I was running my Shadows Angels game, my very first one, and I had come up with a not head bad guy, basically. I mean, he kind of a similar level of Darth Vader with the Emperor. He was the right hand, dude to the big bad of the game. And this guy was, for all intents and purposes, like a Lovecraftian demon. It was very, almost cosmic horror level of a bad guy. I had made him defeatable, but he was supposed to be incredibly tough. In probably his second appearance, he showed up during a battle because this guy's thing was if you ever said his name 3 times, he would show up. He had that kind of
Candyman.
Yeah, he had the Beetlejuice effect.
Haster.
Yeah, he had the Beetlejuice effect going. And the player characters unwisely, were sort of saying, well, thank God.
Oh my God, it's coming through the window. Sorry.
They had that whole situation of, I thank God this guy's not here. And one other player goes, who? That guy. You remember we beat him? Oh, that guy. In the booth. Yeah. So it was already a nasty battle. And then he showed up to make it even more nasty. And what happened was player characters rolled exceptionally well on critical hits and just max damages. And I was like, wow, he showed up and he went down. It was just that fast. And there was part of me, kind of like Chris, where I'm just like, man, as a DM, I'm like, I want to preserve this guy's, mystique as being a powerful, badass dude. But at the same time, I was looking around the table and I saw on the faces of all of my players, they were just anticipation. They were all just on the edges of their seats. They had their fists clenched and they were just like, oh, yes. And I said, you know what? I think it's okay if they just curb stomp my villain because they are going to remember this moment. And they did. It was a high five. It's Miller time moment, for my gaming group. And first of all, they loved the fact that they didn't expect him to be there. And then they loved the fact also that he showed up and then got put down like a punk. And, I was like, if they're enjoying it this much, how can I not empower that? How can I not just allow that fun factor to grow? Even if it's like, well, yeah, it's at the expense of this bad guy's mistake, but that's okay because I have plenty more where he came from, right? I'm the GM. I can make more bad guys. Crunch all you want.
Grindel's
and
mother.
Ross, that's awesome because, the GM's job, you are there to entertain. And, if the players are having a good time and, I think that's the way to go.
So I guess that's a lesson I learned that day was I think sometimes it's okay to let the villains just get curb stomped turned into, it's okay. Maybe not all the time, but certainly sometimes.
because that's another tactic I wanted to get you guys' opinion on, was what I call Grindel's mother. Okay, you guys curb stomped my bad guy. Now his boss is noticed you. So what do you guys think about trying that one? And then you create another character that's even more badass, that's now has a personal vendetta against the group.
Well, I think there's ways to do it that's good. I think, Buffy did a great job of that sometimes, where they would take, Monster of the Week and then turn it into a servant of this guy who is a servant of that guy. And then there's Dragon Ball Z, which, probably didn't do it quite so well, where it's like, of course you only defeated my minion. He was just a test, and then of course you defeated the guy up from him and he's like, aha, but I was a minion of so-and-so. So, I think it's all in the way you handle it, right? I mean, it's in the context of the game, but
I'm saying
in general, I would have to say I'm in favor.
Like a quick solution is like, oh crap, this person wasn't supposed to die. What am I going to do? And then I've got all these plots that I've written for the next 15 sessions that all rely on this guy being alive. This is kind of a roll with it and a kind of crapshoot. No, I'm not saying do this constantly like Dragon Ball Z, where you're fighting through this guy to get to this guy to get this guy to get to this guy. But this person's dead. I'm not going to take all these plots and schemes and put them onto someone higher in the hierarchy.
Well, here's the thing: if it's an important guy to your campaign, right? If this is somebody you had plans for and you had things that he was going to do, you absolutely should find a new vector of getting those things into your game. And the lesson I've learned from Chris Avellone is find something interesting about that. Find a way to make the character say, okay, so what did we learn from curb stomping that bad guy that we now take into the next step towards the final confrontation? I think that's where I would go for it. But absolutely, if there's unfinished business that you as a GM have prepared for, there's no reason why you shouldn't, take that and repurpose it and bring it back in the game in a new vector.
It's in that particular example, if it was like a superhero game, for example, and certainly the player, I had a pretty peaceful group in the sense that they weren't killers. We actually had a separate campaign for the killers, and we recognized that the villains were there to be churned through, and that was fine. But with in a superhero campaign, I think one interesting aspect is sure, you wipe out, so say they kill the Joker, or they kill Lex Luthor, or whoever it is, someone that you're like, holy crap, the campaign cannot survive without him. In that instance, I'd probably, again, like Ross is saying, I try and find some way to make that death interesting, yet still keep the tension going, in the sense that, okay, well, both either Lex Luthor or the Joker, they have a last will and testament, and all it required to be triggered was them to die. Like, what would Lex Luthor do if, the Justice League of America killed him? Like, I would think the world was in a pretty dangerous situation, because if he didn't have anything left to lose, and there's a chance that Superman might still be out there,
he's going to throw the dead man switch.
I believe there would be contingency plans all over the place that would suddenly erupt that he would just pull off. And I'm sure the Joker would do that too in his own crazy nihilistic way. So I would probably just use it as an opportunity and then see if you can put the threats the villain was going to do had he been there in the context of the last will and testament, and go, okay, well, I already set all of these events in motion. And now, because you've killed me, there's no way to stop them. Yeah.
It's the Xanatos Gambit. You have played directly into my plans, heroes.
Okay.
Killing me was the first step towards my ultimate victory.
I hate to tell you guys this, but I think I'm going to have to cut this part of the podcast because I really, really love it and I want to use it.
Okay.
You're not allowed to do that.
Just bleep the whole thing.
And
then bleep, bleep, bleep. The best thing to do, bleep, bleep, bleep.
There's another thing you could pull from. I mean, I'm not going to endorse this quite as heartily because I don't think it's quite as good for RPGs as some of the other things we've talked about. But there is always the approach that Straczynski took in Babylon 5, where he actually had trapdoors built into his main characters, where he had a plan B for if that actor were to leave the show, and could basically replace them with a character that would accomplish the same, that would hit all the same, check marks towards the scripted, confrontation at the end. So I suppose, one alternative might be is to just maybe write down a little postcard or a few sentences, maybe a paragraph of, if this villain does get curb stomped, I've got a plan B. Just saying, there are some GMs out there who that might fit their particular style as a suggestion.
Yeah, and then also, I think Babylon 5 also had that additional advantage, and then there were so many conflicts going on at so many different levels that even knocking one of the bad guys out certainly didn't reduce any of the dramatic tension for the series. Like there was so many other threats you had to worry about that was only a temporary stop. And in fact, even knocking a main character out could arguably make the entire situation worse for everybody, which was another interesting aspect for like, hey, what if what if you're convincing your players that perhaps killing the evil emperor is not a good idea, because if his entire government becomes destabilized, then you lose the war effort that they could have marshaled to help you out. Like, that's a terrible, horrible dilemma to throw at the players. Like, well, we have to tolerate this guy for a while until we win the war, but man, he's not a very good person.
Yeah. Well, I love, one of the things I love about, GMing is to throw those awkward, moral questions in there and say, you got to make a choice here, and neither one of them is just obvious black and white. So, yeah.
Well, you could shoot the problem, but the problem could then explode.
Yeah, exactly.
So one more I wanted to bring up before we move on to another subject. We've been going on for a while about this, but this one is actually in the core Shadowrun book. At least it was in 2nd and 3rd edition, which is Did You Find the Body? Which is, sure, they get a lucky shot and blow the guy's head off, and the body falls back, and then the shot hits a support beam, and the building collapses on top of them, and you guys got to get out of here now before Lone Star gets here. And then he shows up several sessions later, put back together with cyberware and gum.
My group always calls that, he's got Doc Wagon, or there's always Doc Wagon.
Yep.
There's always Doc Wagon. If they find a hair, they'll clone him from it. He paid them very well, Yeah, that is always a possibility. There are some very memorable bad guys. There's an anime called Giant Robo that has one of my favorite villains.
Oh my god, that is a great series.
Baron Alberto from Giant Robo is like the coolest dude in the universe as far as bad guys go, but he's also the master of the Did You Find the Body? His whole deal is he can control every molecule in his body.
Yep.
And he can turn into pretty much anything. So at one point in the show, he gets shot in the face, falls off a cliff, and everyone assumes he's dead because they can't find the body. He turned into a drift of snow and shows up later in one of the most epic final FUs to the bad guy, to the actual bad guy I've ever seen.
That's a fantastic example and a lesson to learn from. If you give a villain a really interesting narrative reason for their powers, for why they can keep coming back. I read this comic called the Thunderbolts. So basically, it's Marvel's version of the Suicide Squad. And in the issue, Red Leader, who's a very, very smart guy, just happens to casually mention that he stores backup brains on the internet. So if he ever gets killed or whatever, a new brain is downloaded somewhere. But he just throws it out
us
there.
If they get the Fortron brain.
Oh.
Oh my God, we're drowning in horrible pictures of horrible things that I can't unsee. Oh God.
Keep screaming
Splashing water in my eyes.
Get the fuck out.
No, that's a really cool idea, yeah. And Chris, by the way, kudos. I had no idea you'd seen Giant Robo, so that's a whole new conversation for us to have.
And I had no idea that anyone else read Thunderbolts other than me.
Yeah, and you know what, guys? For your interview with Tim Donnelly, ask him about Giant Robo, because he's the one who introduced me to it.
Oh, okay, that'll be fun. That will be fun. And so, Daryl, I do want to move on. So I just want to ask you, do you have anything else you wanted to say about that?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything. I mean, there's one other one, but it's always been, in my opinion, the lamest way to do, which is throw mooks at the PC so the bad guy can get away. That's the cheapest way you can do it. In my opinion.
Yeah,
it works, but
players hate to lose is the thing. So that's one of the things about you can do the classic. I found this out trying to run feng shui, for example, and I wanted to do the classic. The bad guys show up, have a fight, and then they escape. We'll get you next time gadget. And yeah, players just hate that, like, I can't believe they got away, and they will do everything in their power. You know, you're like, well, no, the chase scene happens and then they get away. So that is definitely, if you want to do that, that is really one of those where I would strongly say, get the trust of your group and explain to them, guys, here's the thing. I want, trust me, it's going to be awesome, but they get away. You know?
That reminds me of a story of one that I actually did that goes along with your role with it. And did you find the body? And except they kept finding the body. It was a D&D campaign, and I made the most under-optimized anti-paladin 3rd edition has ever seen. He had like 5 classes, including monk. What happened was the PCs kept slaughtering him. And I'm like, I really want to use this guy again. So I kept having him try to get away, and they would go through extensive lengths to chase him down and kill him. And then I would just have the body. The first time I did it, the body vanished. Contingency spell, blah, blah. I knew I couldn't pull that off again because they were pissed. Then every single other time he died, the rest of the guys got away and dragged the body with them or cut off a lock of hair or a finger. And of course he comes back again. And then there was the one time they completely obliterated the body. He still came back because it's D&D. There's resurrection spells.
Yeah, in those cases, I think you've got to have a talk with the players about expectations, because I think in a situation like that, the player's default expectation is this is a problem that they can solve if only they come up with the right solution. And they're going to feel frustrated because there is no right solution. You know what I mean?
Well, the first time it was frustrating. At that point, it just became a running gag because it was the opposing adventuring group. They were both chasing after the same goal. So it was like the counterparts to all of them. And to give them that they can get away every time, I'll get you next time, Gadget, this anti-paladin became the sacrificial lamb that they got to slaughter every single time. And my group loved it. So
that is a really interesting way to do it. That's pretty cool. You know what? I think I may steal that, and if I do, after they catch on to what's going on, I think I will be sure to give you credit, Daryl. Thank you for that.
Well, I stole an idea from you, so feel free to have that one.
Well, I think at this point I have to do something, because the Planescape Torment fans will just destroy me if I have Chris Avellone on my podcast, in a podcast about villains, and we don't talk about Ravel Puzzle Well.
Oh my God! Okay.
I think that is just a necessary conversation to have.
Yes, the proto Kreia.
Yeah, well, I think one of the coolest things, I went to Tampere, Finland, to talk to guys at a convention called Trakon about gaming. I was a guest of honor, and they had a panel about Planescape Torment, because the new Torment Numenera had just been announced, and they were really excited to talk about the old game and what the new game was going to come out with, and they invited me to come join them on the panel, which I thought was awesome. And on the panel, the only really thing I had to add, I said, "Did you guys know that Ravel Puzzlewell has kind of shown up in some other games?" And Darth Kreia is a reflection of Ravel Puzzlewell, and they were like, "Ooh, this was new information." So. Anyway, Chris, why don't you tell us, who is Ravel and what makes her special as a villain?
Ravel Puzzlewell is an extremely powerful night hag in the Planescape universe, and her entire sort of character concept revolves around the fact that her existence is kind of like this tree that grows throughout the plains. So in any instance where you're confronting her, that's only one branch of her many personalities that you might, find at another place in time or another dimension. And we try to reinforce that by actually having her show up in the Icewind Dale series, for example. Like, generally anytime you saw an elderly blind character in the Icewind Dale games, there was some hint that even if they didn't realize it themselves, that was one of Ravel's aspects that would occur in the Forgotten Realms.
She's kind of like the Eternal Champion, but for bad guys.
Yes, and that way, that also provided a convenient excuse so that when she, should she ever befall a horrible fate, in torment, hypothetically, there was always her very character explanation lent itself to, well, she could still be around in some other form for some other branch that hasn't died yet. And we'd already reinforced that with players much earlier on in the game as they encountered aspects of her that they didn't necessarily realize.
Updated my journal.
Yes. And then, and part of her character concept was I thought it would be really interesting if she was an antagonist who was genuinely trying to do the right thing, but she was trying too hard. And she ended up making a situation even more broken than it was. But she did it for all the right reasons, and she did it because she, primarily, cared about doing the right thing, but two, like she felt very, motherly towards the player character. Like she loved him. She wanted to help him out. She wanted to improve his state in life. And then things did not go very well in the long scheme of things, and it had all sorts of horrible night hag complications that come along with that. And I just thought that'd be really interesting for a player to explore, where you've had this huge build up to how nasty this person is and all the evils they've done, which is a lot like you in Torment. And then you meet her, and there's a lot more going on. And even though she's incredibly dangerous and powerful, on some level you realize that, this kind of sucks because she was actually just trying to do the right thing and help someone out. She just didn't do a very good job of it.
Well, just as a quick aside, I think if you looked at Accursed and you looked at the Crone or Baba Yaga, you might also see some hints of Ravel Puzzlewell. Although they're not blind, but I didn't quite want to go quite that far. But it would be lying for me to say that I wasn't feeling a little bit of that when I was working.
By the way, I liked what you did with Baba Yaga. I thought that the way you've done her character concept and the thing that she's struggling with, and the layer to her backstory, which I actually wasn't expecting until I got to her section of the rulebook, was very, very well done, Ross. I don't want to spoil it for any players playing at Accursed, but I thought that was very tricky and clever and interesting.
Oh, thank you. Well, I can't take full credit for that. Jason Marker, one of my co-authors, and we both kind of worked together on that, so I will give him the lion's share of the credit. But yeah, thank you. And I just want to say, that's one of the things I thought was great about Ravel. She was inspiring. She was a type of villain, as we said before, iconic in some ways. And I love kind of how you've been, reusing her, and how you took that one central concept that she is kind of everywhere, that she is unraveled, as they say, in throughout the planes. And we do see her show up in Star Wars, and we see her show up in the Forgotten Realms.
Well, to be fair, the Star Wars. Kreia, there's actually no story connection between the two of them. Kreia was just born out of the fact that I felt there was a lot more stories to tell about Ravel, and there were some themes about Ravel's character that I didn't feel I'd gotten enough of.
Hey, listen, Hasbro owns the whole thing now, so it's cool.
Okay.
They own D&D and they own Star Wars. It's fine. You just say it. Yeah.
So with Knights of the Republic 2, I was just like, you know what? I'd always wondered what it would have been like if you'd been able to get Ravel as a companion in your party. And then I'm like, well, okay, there's an opportunity to do it. I'll just, make her an ex-Sith Lord. And then you can, then you can have a character that uses some of Ravel's themes and personality, and then just go from there. And that was a lot of the inspiration for it.
Yeah. Well, Kreia is everyone's evil grandma. She's like, you need to be guided, young one. You need to be guided towards the proper use of your die. She's awesome. But like I said, I think it's what from the standpoint of creating villains, though. I think that's a neat idea that if you have, let's say I'm a DM, let's say I come up with what I think is, my favorite villain, whatever that may be, and then, you establish somehow that this villain is active in other worlds and other continuities and other places and times. That's the thing I thought was most compelling about it, is that then you could basically pull anything out. Like if you wanted to have, let's say we are, in Planescape, and we come across, some crazy pictograph that shows us pictures of a high-tech universe, and we see Ravel Puzzlewell there. That wouldn't be that surprising because you've already built up that concept. You know what I'm saying? Yep. And there's, with gaming groups that have been together for a really long time, of which I've been privileged to be a part of a couple times, it's interesting to see those recurring themes. And I think having recurring villains, even across campaigns, even across game systems, is actually kind of a cool idea if you do it right. And I think Ravel is a really good way of example of doing it right.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if you provide the right narrative explanation, I think there's a whole bunch of ways you can do that. As long as the players have been introduced to the concept early, they understand that's part of the lore. And then I think it's just it's like you're saying, like encountering those people again and again, and you know the reason why you can do that. Like I think it just gives a lot more weight, to meeting that character, in the game. So,
and as I said, it's not going to work with every group because it's going to rely on that recognition. So it's going to need a group that does things together for quite a while. But I'm sure some of our listeners are blessed enough to have long-term gaming groups like that. So. I just thought I'd bring it up as an example. And that's going to bring us pretty close to last call. So we should really
I got one more thing
give Daryl a chance to talk.
I was going to say, I've got one last thing. We got Chris on the show. I've got to ask him this. And Ross, you as well, because you've also worked in multimedia. How does your approach to creating a villain change in different media? Because I could go up and wholesale steal a villain from my favorite book or TV show, but that may not work in a tabletop role-playing game. So how do you approach the different genre, the different media? Is a villain a villain, or do you have to tweak them to make them work in an RPG? Is there a different approach?
That is a good question. Sometimes it depends on, very rarely do I actually have the luxury of working on something that we as a studio create. Like usually we're using something like either Star Wars or Aliens, and each of those genres comes with its own rules for how you should portray villains. Like Star Wars has a different presentation for how the villains should be in Star Wars, and that guides a lot of your design parameters for those villains. Aliens also has a very certain way of how you should present aliens. Like one thing that we struggled with Aliens is, they are not like things that you talk to or socialize or have to, try and negotiate, diplomatically with them. They are a force of nature in the game. And as such, how do you present them as that force of nature? And how do you present the information about aliens to the player? Because to an extent, giving aliens stats that are visible to a player makes them less scary. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Like giving things like the Force in Star Wars actual numbers and 20d6, I think that actually hurts the presentation of the Force. And those are things you have to carry into the villains as well. So to reference back to
stats, they will kill it.
Exactly. And is that always what you want? Like is that the best way to portray a Force user in Star Wars? Is numbers the way to go? Like I don't know if I agree with that. Like that's a good point to bring up. The other thing was what you were saying earlier before about how to present the villain without the players feeling like they're being gypped because they can't kill him. And that's a struggle that developers have had for a long time. Usually, there's either the indestructible glass wall, or, one thing that I tend to fall back on is, hey, this person is speaking to you through a camera or a hologram. It's very clear why you can't kill them, but yet at the same time, it's still important that you're exposing the player to that villain early on, or as early as you can, because you want them to realize who the supposed adversary is and assign a face to that character as well, because it's important, because that gives it added weight when you encounter that villain later on. You're like, oh, I know who that is, without them saying a word. You're like, visually, I know who that character is, and I know why his appearance is a big deal because of all the foreshadowing I laid for it. And that can either be, a symbol the character has, like an evidence of that character's passage. Like one thing we did for the New Vegas DLCs is a lot. We had a problem in that because you could play them out of order, you could potentially have killed the villain in the very first DLC you go to, or the antagonist of the first DLC you go to. But we had to include ways of how do we include this villain/antagonist presence in the other DLCs if he's already potentially dead, or the player can't directly interact with him because voice actors are expensive. And we broke it down into that antagonist has a symbol.
Ulysses.
That he uses quite frequently. So as you're going through areas and you see that symbol, you're like, hey, that's kind of weird. And then you see a pattern to that symbol, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And then you see the context where those symbols are showing up. And then suddenly you draw a voice to that symbol, and then a person's appearance to that symbol, and then you start interacting with it. There's ways to build it up without the villain actually being there physically.
And I think Chris did a really genius thing, is he actually took that a further step with Ulysses, because Ulysses' whole thing is he's sending you a message. He's a messenger.
Yep.
And that's what I was like, oh, wow. So not only is that symbol, as Chris was saying, serving the purpose of introducing us to him and having us interact with him without him being there, it's also core to his concept because he's sending us a message and we're receiving that message. That's what I'm getting. That's what I loved about Ulysses. Sorry, go ahead.
And that's there's ways to do it, and game developers have to struggle with that quite a bit because players are very trigger happy, and no matter how well you set up a cutscene, they will find some way to kill Lord British.
Well, I think it's fair to say we've discussed on this podcast that players are very trigger happy in both the RPG area and the video game area. So yeah. Although what Chris was talking about, what did bring up something that is more specifically RPG related and villainy, and we should have probably discussed this earlier, especially with Daryl's well-known proclivities. But Lothweir is a iconic villain, and he is the way he's implemented in Shadowrun, for example, is in a way where he doesn't have stats, right? Well, at least I don't think he
does
normally. Well, all right. Sometimes he has stats. Depends on which edition we're talking about.
Yes.
But the key thing with Lothweir is he's already thought of that. That's his power. That's his main ability. He's already thought of that.
His other main power is you're never going to interact with Lothweir directly. You're going to go through like 8 layers of his
that's
corporate
the challenge,
structure.
right? I mean, that's what Chris was just talking about, is I think that's the thing that I would want to emphasize to a Shadowrun GM who wanted to use Lothweir, was to kind of maybe take some of the things Chris had just talked about and find ways to, because it is kind of, I mean, Lothweir is best when he is someone that the players have spoken to, have talked to, have interacted with. I don't think he's best as a faceless, name whispered on the wind that we never ever talk to, but can always foil our plans, right? I think it's better off, as Chris says, if you have some kind of interaction with them. So that's all I'm saying, is I think that's the challenge.
I would concur with that.
Are you familiar with Lothweir, Chris?
I wasn't until you started describing it, but he sounds like a really great character concept.
Yeah, he's a dragon who is also the CEO of a mega corporation. So he's super smart, super rich, and physically super powerful, right? I mean, he's pretty much the apex predator of the Shadowrun. And what that means is like he's got all the resources he needs to crush or anything. And I think Lothweir is a great concept and idea, but I think sometimes it can be really frustrating. It's almost like the Elminster effect in reverse. The Elminster effect is a bad guy, whereas in Forgotten Realms, pretty much any problem can be solved by Elminster. In Shadowrun, pretty much anything you do as a Shadowrunner can be undone by Lothweir, and you know that, right? So any interaction with Lothweir kind of becomes like a Xanatos Gambit, where he's like, I knew you would do that, therefore I have prepared this contingency. And I think the challenge then ahead of you as a Shadowrun GM is to find a way to make that compelling and interesting to your characters. And I just think that some of the advice that we've discussed on this podcast would be where I would point you to maybe, add a little depth to that. Daryl, do you concur?
Yes.
I have reduced Daryl to wordlessness.
I'm also friggin' exhausted too, so brain worky, right? But yeah, Lufware is a great villain, a great concept for a villain. But like I said, you got to approach him carefully, or else you're running into a lot of the problems we've already talked about, where it's going to be frustrating for the players because they can't beat this guy. It's going to be frustrating to them if they never actually get to directly interact with him, at least in some way, shape, or form. But it's also a really good... He is a good, final villain, in my opinion, because you can start laying hints so early in a campaign because he's working through so many cat's paws that they never figure it out until suddenly the one clue falls into place and, oh my god, Lothbeer's been behind this the whole time. And that's when they get that clue moment, and then they know who they're going for, and that's when we can start getting that interaction in, because by that point in the game, they're going to have the experience with the system, as well as the more experienced players with the better gear and better stats, that they might stand a chance against being able to do something about whatever plan he's got hatching. I know that was not a dragon pun.
Well, yeah. But I think that does actually bring us pretty close to the last call. So why don't we let Chris tell the listeners where they can find you on the web and what your latest things are that they should be keeping an eye out for.
Oh, well, thank you, Ross. First off, I wanted to extend the invitation to anyone listening that if you ever have questions about game development or game writing, I always am happy to try and provide advice or answer questions. Usually the best avenue I have for that is my Twitter account, which is called imaginatively enough, just Chris Avellone. And if you can fit your question within 140 characters, please feel free to drop me a line. And if I can provide advice, I'm always happy to do that. When I was trying to get in the industry, there were very few people that would answer my questions. And now that I'm in the industry, I would like to change that. So please feel free. Do not be shy. Currently, projects that I'm working on is I finished up a lot of the pre-production work for Wasteland 2, although I'm still writing the more fictionalized stuff for Wasteland 2 as well, which I believe they're going to have in a recent update, either today. I haven't checked the net recently, obviously. Either today or tomorrow, although today is going to be different because I don't know what day this podcast is going on. But anyway, look for it. And then, and then I'm working on Torment, Tides of Numenera with a lot of the old crew. Colin McComb, who was on the first game, and Kevin Saunders, who I've worked with quite a bit on previous projects, including Knights of the Republic 2 and Mass the Betrayer, and he is a great guy. And Adam Heine is also on the Numenera game, which is great. And my buddy Monty Cook, who rejected so many of my proposals. But they got a really good crew going on with that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where things go.
You know, I would love to see if you ever have a list of these things or something of the proposals that you sent, because I'm just kind of curious as to what you wanted to do.
Some of them are pretty terrible, and I don't blame him. Although one did break my heart because I had a whole collection of short adventures just called One Night Stands. And those had some of my favorite adventure hooks in it, and I was sad when that one got the big no as well. But I got to work with Monty again eventually down the road, and I hope that he was happy with the Torment game when it first came out. So hopefully that redeemed me in his eyes, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, the only last thing I'm going to leave you with is you were also responsible for that guy who blew up my girlfriend in Alpha Protocol. Dave's fault.
Sort of. That is a very complicated story. So sometimes when you are a narrative designer for computer games, and I'll keep this really short, Daryl, you inherit a lot of characters. And when I first started writing on Alpha Protocol, I actually was given all the character models and backstories, and I had to rearrange them like pawns to tell another version of that story, which is a very interesting experience. So the original murder of that girlfriend was actually designed by Brian Mitsoda, who's working on, I believe, Dead State right now, which is another Kickstarter RPG.
Damn you, Brian Mitsoda!
And originally she was supposed to get blown up under a different set of circumstances, which we ended up changing in the second version. But yeah, unfortunately, she she was destined to die down one of those branches, but that was not from my brainchild.
But that's one of the things you love to do. I mean, I think that's the thing I love to do, especially in a superhero game, is to say, well, you can capture me, hero, or you can disarm this bomb I've placed in the orphanage. You know, and that's the choice you get now for Protocol, where I was like, oh, God damn it. Oh, no. And so, yeah, I had to, in order to save the world, I had to let my girlfriend get blown up.
I respect your choice, Ross. It's the greater good.
The greater good.
Unfortunately, the life of a spy is bigger than any one person.
And that's what we're sort of shooting for there. So I respect that.
All right, man. Hey, it's been a real pleasure having you on the Gamers Tavern. Thank you so much for dropping by and joining us and letting us know all about how to build awesome villains.
Well, Ross and Daryl, thanks again for inviting me. This was a blast. I really enjoyed it. And if I get around to that Arcanum playthrough and get all the way to the end, I would love to have a podcast where we just discuss Arcanum between us and see what comes out of it.
Oh yeah, I am down for that. I will hopefully get Daryl to play the game before then, and we will definitely I take you up on that offer for sure.
Sounds great.
All right, and Daryl, did you have anything last to say? As the barkeep is giving me the eye, it's old Mac is saying that it's time to put the mugs away.
Well, that's about it. But Chris, did you happen to mention the Kickstarter that you have one going on right about now, don't you? That you're involved in?
You know what, Daryl? Thank you very much. That is a horrible oversight on my part. So, to get a little bit backstory, I got to be a cameo on the Wayside Creations Nuka Break web series, which was set in the world of Fallout.
It's so awesome. You got to see it.
They did a really good job with it. Both seasons are now online, plus a movie they did called Red Star, which was fantastic. And they decided that they had such a good experience with that they wanted to look for other game properties to do web series and or movies based off of. And I was able to introduce them to the Legend of Grimrock developers. And they were very excited about the possibilities. So they started a brand new Kickstarter, which is running right now. It's basically to fund a Legend of Grimrock web series, much like what they did with Fallout Nuka Break. And I'm a big Grimrock fan, and I hope that there's more Grimrock fans out there that would want to see something like that, because I think Wayside Creations would do a really, really good job with it.
And if anybody out there wants to make a web series about Accursed, email Ross at thegamerstavern.org.
And how long is that Kickstarter running for, Chris?
That I'm not sure how many days it has left as of this moment.
And that is a worthy cause, so I definitely endorse that as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Daryl. I feel ashamed that I did not think to keep that on my radar. Forgive me, Wayside Creations. Forgive me, Zach. I'm so sorry.
That's what producers are for.
Well, the good news is you did get the word out to all of our listeners. So, again, thank you for showing up on the show, and we will be looking forward to talking to you again in the future.
It'll be my pleasure.
We here at the Gamers Tavern would like to once again thank Chris for taking the time out of his very busy schedule to be with us tonight. And I'm sorry if we kind of spoiled you last time with Ross joining us for reading the comments, but like many freelance game designers, Ross is very busy, and that's one thing I've kind of learned since starting this podcast in October, is that scheduling freelance game designers is a lot like herding cats. Their schedules are always in flux, and unfortunately Ross couldn't be with us tonight. And speaking of back in October, I don't know if you guys actually know what I do on this podcast, aside from, drunkenly ramble, but I kind of handle all the behind-the-scenes stuff for the most part. That's why I put Ross up front and center. He's the host of the show. He takes care of a lot of the above-the-line stuff. If you remember us talking about that a couple of podcasts ago. He's the on-air talent. I handle the editing. I handle the equipment. I handle the accounting. And that's where I'm just been fucking floored by you guys and how awesome you are, because I looked at the numbers for our listenership and I don't know what we did. I don't know what you guys did. You're spreading the word, and I love that, because this is January 16th and we at this point in time have already far surpassed the number of listeners we had our entire first month. This week alone, since the last episode, has the same number of listeners that we had for the entire month of January. So I am just completely blown away. I am so glad you guys are listening. I'm so glad you guys are spreading the word. And please keep doing so. Keep posting on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google+. Let people know about the podcast, because you guys are the reason why we do this. It's as much fun as it is for us to sit here and chat with game designers and talk about all these things. It means nothing if we're talking to dead air. This is all about you, and we really appreciate it, and we thank you so much. And again, speaking of how we can hear from you, we are going to talk about a few comments. And again, I want to praise you guys, because a lot of these comments were about our last episode, which was on Edition Wars. And it was particularly one of the most contentious periods in Dungeons & Dragons history, when we're talking about Wizards of the Coast taking over, 3rd edition, Pathfinder, 4th edition D&D, and all the comments we've gotten have been civil and cordial and very nice, and I'm impressed you exemplified the best in the gaming culture, and I want to thank you so much for that. But let's go ahead and start reading some of these comments from our listeners. We have one from, let's go ahead and start off with one of our regulars, the Grumpy Celt, or the Grumpy Celt. Okay, dude, can you please do me a favor and send me an email or a message and let me know which pronunciation you prefer, because depending on dialect and region, both are technically correct, and I always kind of feel like an asshole when I mispronunciate someone's name, especially when it's a username, considering mine is abstruse, and I cannot count how many times people have, dropped the S. Abstruse, Bruce, obtuse, it's a dictionary word. It's a word in the English language. Look it up in a dictionary. It's in Sherlock Holmes novels. Forgotten. Okay, sorry. Anyway, the Grumpy Celt, or Celt, says, another entertaining episode. I also like 4th edition, though I know it's unpopular in some circles. Part of why I like it is the graphic design. Everything is very clear in terms of powers, timing, and the like. However, I hate 4th edition Forgotten Realms. I hate it so much, I had revelation and realized that 4th edition Forgotten Realms is part of the anti-life equation sought by Dark Side. I'm not gonna quite say anything on that, but there's a reason why I picked this comment to read. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, but draw your own conclusions. Anyway, he continues. I also wrote Thieves Guild and Banking Guild for Ian Publishing. Banking is kind of silly in a Terry Pratchett sort of manner. The dungeons of liches and vampires are mortgaged to the hilt. Anyway, I had to write up 2 prestige classes for the book, and those were the weakest part of the book. And I'm sure you guys remember the podcast from last week where we talked about this, and prestige classes were a double-edged sword, to say the least. It was a great idea that, because of the OGL license, and because of just the bloat of the editions, and things just went to hell. By the way, correct me if I'm wrong here, but Ian Publishing is the game publishing branch of Ian World, which is one of the bigger RPG message boards. I know this because I've talked to Morris a lot. Morris is one of the guys behind Ian World, and I've tried to get him on the podcast many times, but he is scheduling. Remember what I said about herding cats? Imagine herding cats and adding in a 6-hour time difference. So yeah, hopefully we'll have him on. But yeah, I love Ian World, and they do some really, really high quality books. If you haven't seen them before, check them out. We have another one from Andreas Share. I apologize again for mispronouncing. I'm sorry, I'm butchering it. Andreas says, belated happy holidays and happy new year to both of you. Well, thank you very much. Happy holidays to you as well. I've been waiting on this episode since part 1. I have always thought Hasbro dropped the ball when they acquired Wizards of the Coast, since they don't seem to have done much with the possibilities. I mean, really, where are the G.I. Joe and Transformer RPGs? Okay. While I see what you're saying when it comes to Hasbro and D&D, Ross kind of made the perfect point in our last episode of the podcast, where he talked about how tiny of a drop in the bucket Wizards of the Coast is to Hasbro. There are pretty much 2 companies that dominate any sort of family or children's entertainment. That's Hasbro and Mattel. So, literally, it is a drop in the bucket for anything that Wizards of the Coast does, according to them. So, if you want a Transformers RPG or a G.I. Joe RPG or anything like that, really, Wizards of the Coast would have to go to Hasbro and ask them for it, because any sort of profits they would see off that, because the RPG industry, while it's one of the biggest growth industries in entertainment in terms of percentage, it's still a tiny, tiny slice of the pie overall. So you definitely do not want to blame Hasbro for that one. But that does lead me to a very interesting story that's kind of come to light recently, where apparently they have been working for years to do a Dungeons and Dragons setting for Magic the Gathering. I mean, seriously, how much of a no-brainer is that? Magic the Gathering setting for D&D. They tried apparently 3 times to get that printed and on the board. It just fell apart every single time because, like Ross was talking about in that episode, the corporate culture that ended up getting involved. It's 2 different departments kind of fighting over it. So you would get this department statting up this creature, this planeswalker, and the other department saying, no, that's not right. It needs to be more powerful or less powerful. And yeah, that sort of stuff happens in these sort of environments. But yeah, things broke down every single time they tried to do it. Anyway, Andreas had another comment based on something Ross posted on the Gamers Tavern, where he asked, and I would seriously like to hear from you as well, he asked what you would like to hear from the upcoming year, 2014, from the Gamers Tavern. And his reply was, Ross, in response to your question, what we'd like to hear you cover in upcoming episodes, how about actual play podcasts and online RPG sites like Obsidian Portal and Inferno? Well, we've been planning, since I started this podcast, I built this entire site, this network, for growth. So I have been planning since day 1 to expand beyond just our Gamers Tavern podcast. And if things go to plan within the next month, you'll start seeing some of those seeds grow, and actual play podcasts have been part of that. But that's not on the table quite yet, just because of I'm still working out some technical problems, because if I do an actual play, I still want high quality audio on it, and doing that online can sometimes be a problem, and I don't want to expose you guys to my gaming group. Seriously, you've heard me talk about them. But yeah, I just wanted to let you know that that is something we're looking towards, and hopefully we'll get that for you soon. And as far as your other things that you were talking about, I also wanted to let you know that we've recorded an episode. And any grammar Nazis in the crowd might not like this phrase, but I'm kind of doing it just to piss you off, because I'm one of you, but I really like this phrase. The first annual Gamers Tavern Awards. Ross and I got together and poured over all the games that came out in 2013, and we picked our favorites. Now, because of some technical difficulties I talked about at the beginning of the episode, I don't know if that's going to be next week or the week after that we're going to air the awards, but that award show is going to go up, and we're going to talk about our favorites from last year as a retrospective. My con schedule is still really, really in flux right now. But Ross is going to be at ChupacabraCon in Austin, Texas this weekend. So if you're listening to this podcast live when it airs, if you're in Central Texas, go there. If you're not in Central Texas, hurry up. If you're listening to it late, keep listening to future episodes and see when we're going to show up again. Or you can just wait until February 13th through 16th, where Ross will be in Genghis Khan in Aurora, Colorado, which is just outside Denver. He is running a crapload of games, including many sessions of Accursed. I looked at this guy's schedule. I don't know how he does it. Maybe it's because he doesn't drink. That might have something to do with it. But yeah, definitely show up to these cons. You can find out more about ChupacabraCon at chupacabracon.com, and you can find out more about Genghis Khan at denvergamers.org. Both of these links are in our show notes, as well as many of the links from the rest of the podcast. Now, if you would like us to read your comment on air, please leave us a comment at our website at gamerstavern.org. Visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/gamerstavern. Or you can find us on Twitter at gamerstavernpc, as in podcast. And rate us on iTunes. And we will definitely read your comments on air. And that pretty much wraps us up for this week at the Gamers Tavern. The Gamers Tavern is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial, no derivatives 3.0 license. The Accursed theme is Artemis by Asmodeva, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution License. Tavern Brawl is copyright 2013 by Save or Die, all rights reserved. Thank you for listening, and until next time, gamers, the tavern is closed. Hello, gamers. I'm Daryl Mott Jr. from Anacle News Tabletop and the Gamers Tavern Podcast, which you probably know because I'm betting I was just talking a second ago. I'm sure you already know about DriveThruRPG, as it is the biggest repository for digital copies of your favorite games. Dungeons & Dragons, Shadowrun, Battletech, World of Darkness, Numenera, Fate, and so many more. And sometimes there are pennies on the dollar because, face it, PDFs can sometimes be so much more convenient than print copies, but if you need print copies, they sell those too. So if you want to support the Gamers Tavern podcast, click on the affiliate links in the show notes and check out DriveThruRPG.